Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes.
Message from our sponsor, Curtis Brown Creative. If you're an aspiring author, you'll be excited to hear that this week's sponsors are Curtis Brown Creative, the renowned writing school affiliated to the major literary agency.
Since launching in 2011, over 160 of their students have gone on to get major book deals.
CBC run a wide range of courses covering a variety of topics and genres. If you're interested in writing for younger readers, why not join their new 6-week online writing, young adult and middle grade fiction course with exclusive teaching videos, resources and writing tasks from award-winning author Patrice Lawrence.
By the end of the course, you'll have written at least the first 3,000 words of your YA or middle grade novel and developed a plan for the rest of the book. Plus, all students will be given the opportunity to get individual feedback from one of CBC's expert editors.
Visit www.curtisbrowncreative.co.uk to find out more about all the courses on offer.
Curtis Brown Creative have provided an exclusive discount for Always Take Notes listeners. You can use the code ATN20 for £20 off the full price of writing YA and middle grade fiction or any other 4 or 6 week online writing course.
Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, Simon and myself spoke to the children's author and illustrator Lauren Child.
We spoke to Lauren about her hit books, including the Charlie and Lola and Clarice Bean series, her process of writing and illustrating, and the effect of celebrity authors on the children's publishing landscape.
It's a great episode. We hope you enjoy it.
Lauren, welcome to Always Take Notes. It's great to have you on the show. Rachel and I wanted to start with the manifesto that you sent over to us on the value of writing and particularly the value of artistic work for children. Could you tell us a bit about how that came about as a project and the role that the Foundling Museum played? And then why did you think it was needed?
Well, that was interesting because Caro Howe had asked me to be a fellow of the Foundling, and that was very interesting because she invites all kinds of artists from all kinds of different disciplines. And I often find, as a writer who principally works in the sort of children's field, that you get sort of overlooked as if you can't do anything more serious, I suppose, and that you're not quite an adult. There's something really strange about that, where I'm very rarely asked about anything beyond the story that I'm telling, and often even in that way it's quite superficial. And I started to think about that and then think about how do we feel about our children and their childhoods and what they're taking on board and learning, but also how do we feel about our child selves. And the more I thought about it, the more I felt like it's a stage to get through almost, that you continue to grow and grow and grow until you can shed this thing called child and you become an adult. And I thought how actually we're so much more like, I describe it as more like trees, that we just grow with our early experiences and all the injuries and sufferings that we have, and then also all the nourishment we have, and it changes the shape of who we are to a degree. It doesn't have to define us, I don't mean that, but it has an impact on everything we do in some small way possibly, but it does have an impact. And I love what the Foundling do because they recognise that in their work, and I love that they use artists to talk about what it is to be a child, what it is to be an abandoned child, because that's obviously what the Foundling Museum was about and is still about. But it really thinks beyond just its first remit. It thinks beyond that, and it's a very inclusive place. So I sort of started writing about that. And I've been writing about it in many guises as well, as my time as Children's Laureate, and this idea of the time that we need to think that we're not given any longer.
When do you think that particular attitude towards childhood developed or took hold?
Oh, I have no idea. I mean, I don't know. I don't know if it's been around for a very, very, very long time or forever. I really don't know. I think I can only speak of how it feels in this country. And I understand from friends who grew up in Italy and Spain who it didn't quite have the same feel for them. Perhaps children in France, children regard children in a slightly more inclusive way. I don't mean that we don't love our children. I mean, it's quite sort of controlling in terms of what they might be experiencing and thinking about. And I worry in our desire to protect that actually we don't protect. It can be quite harmful, that thing of not explaining. And as a children's writer or a writer for children, I'm trying to wrestle with those things that I wrestled with, not only as a child, I still do wrestle with them, but it's how you communicate to a child some of the really difficult things in life without frightening. You have to give a feeling of support and reassurance, I think. I think that's part of my job as a writer for children.
And what was the reaction to the manifesto like when it came out?
I was quite sort of, I was rather heartened, in fact, because one writes things and I never really expect anything. I feel it's always dangerous to have an expectation of how a book will do, or how an interview will be received, and indeed how a piece of almost like a little essay or something. So I wasn't really expecting anything, and then got some, very nice messages from particularly other children's writers and illustrators, and some who I've never met, and some who live a long, long way away. So I didn't realize that it would have that much reach, and that was rather heartening.
Could we go back now to your own childhood? Who are some of the writers and artists that you admired as a youngster?
Well, predominantly it was what we call fine artists, I suppose, but painters and artists, because my father was an art teacher and passionate, and still is passionate about visiting galleries. And so as children, we just followed along because that's what he wanted to do. And my mother was also very interested, so that wasn't a conflict. She liked to go too, and so we all trotted along. There'd be times where you didn't want to hang out there so long, because my father really looks at a painting, he'll stand looking at it for a very long time because he's studying it like you would read a book. But I think there was a real usefulness in that it taught me that you can look at something a very long time and learn something very interesting. That is an experience looking at a painting, someone's work. It's an experience. It's not, oh, I like that, and then walk on. And also, someone spent an awful long time making that piece of work, and that's what you begin to understand when you see it for real. And when you see it in a collection of work done at the same time, or perhaps an exhibition of that one artist, you see this progression and this understanding and this growing understanding as they work. And I think I found that incredibly helpful in terms of learning to be an artist, I suppose. It's all part of it. And my father also talked very, very interestingly about the work. He was never really interested in what they were doing at the time. So he's not an art history or background person particularly. That's not his thing. He just looks at the design, really, how they design the page, the use of color, the use of focus, the use of scale, all of those things, and how you create something that can often take you right into a world, and it's a flat surface. Because he was particularly, we studied everything. We went to see everything. So from, Giotto and right to the present day, and he's interested in it all. So it taught me you don't have to you don't have to choose. You don't have to, you don't have to choose a time that you're particularly interested in, or you're not interested in this because you're interested in this. Rather, like with music, you can love it all, or love portions of it, but you can be interested in it all. So I think I learned most from looking at those artists, and I think it's possible to see that in my work, and it's a very good way of explaining to children if they want to understand how I work. I can talk about that flat surface and post-impressionism and how they used a surface to, create this incredible world just on it's small, pretty small. And then there were also, of course, there were the books that I loved as a child. Particularly, there were two American authors I loved. Betsy Byers, who's an astonishing writer. She's only recently died, actually, and she wrote a book called The 18th Emergency, which I've talked about a lot because you could read it. I did have to read it recently, and I still think it's an astonishing piece of work. And she taught me that you can be both funny, or that life is both funny and tragic, all at the same time. And that, the things that you see as you walk down the street, you can go through lots and lots of different emotions just looking at things. And you see somebody having the most awful day, and then you see somebody, laughing their head off. And that's what it's all about. And I think that made me realize, there's not one thing. And so I understand why we sometimes do have, prizes for a comic book, as in ha-ha book. But actually, I don't think something has to be defined that way. But I understand why prizes get started for that, because often books that are funny get overlooked as if they're trivial. Far from it, they're incredibly important. But I don't think something has to be one thing or the other.
Could you tell us about the time before your first book was published, in terms of the going to art school and then in your 20s doing these various jobs, working for Damien Hirst? Tell us about that period of your life before you had published your first work.
Well, I had a real problem deciding what to do at sort of 18, 19. And I always found making decisions very difficult. I've got a lot better at it now, but it really was terrifying, and it sent me into this awful spiral of anxiety that if you make a choice at that age, that will define the rest of everything. And I couldn't decide what I wanted to do. I knew it had something to do with drawing and making things, but there were so many things I was interested in. And I decided I'd go to St. Martin's. That was the place I wanted to go in London. And I'd been to visit them a couple of times. So I'd done all the groundwork to go there. And then I had this extraordinary wobble and just didn't know what to do, because my father felt, I think he'd been quite keen that I did fine art. And I knew I didn't have the mindset for that, because you have to be so self-driven, and there is no, I didn't know how would I propel myself and give myself that momentum when there's nothing, there's no deadline, there's no one telling me we need this, there's no commission. So that kind of came in to sort of destabilize me a little bit. And then he'd been up to see Manchester Art School, and he really liked the dean in charge, and so I think I was very much under his influence at that time, my father's influence. So I did what he thought was right, and I went to Manchester, and it was absolutely the wrong decision for me. And I chose to do illustration, which didn't have a graphic design part to it, which the St. Martin's course did. You did illustration and graphic design at that point. And that would have been brilliant for me, because I'm really interested in that side. And it was a bit of a a problem that I think it's been frustrating to me that I never learned that. So I left after a year and had a bit of a rethink of everything, applied for all kinds of courses from, I think, textiles, architecture, illustration, fine art. And I think there was one other, I can't remember. So it was like a sort of scattergun approach to where shall I go? And the only one I got turned down for, ironically, was the illustration course. And so I ended up, I went to a very, very small art school in Kennington. And I did a sort of mixed media type course. And I don't know how much that helped either, but I stuck it out. But I came out absolutely bewildered at the time that the big recession had just begun. So it was a terrible time to come out of art school. And I'd come out very confident for some reason. And I just felt very depleted by the whole thing. But I was good about going along, and cold calling people and having ideas and having meetings. And I did all that sort of thing. But it was a very, very difficult time.
You had your breakthrough in 1999 with I Want a Pet and Clarice Bean, That's Me. Could you tell us a little bit about how you wrote those books and what the path to publication was in each case?
Well, I must have written the Clarice Bean in probably around 95, I think. Possibly a little bit earlier, maybe 94. And I'd had many attempts at writing books for children before. In fact, the first one I did, I wrote with a friend when I think we were 18 or 19. And it did get accepted. I mean, we got a publisher really interested in it. And, it was really funny because I remember them taking us seriously. That was really exciting at that age. And they took us out for this business lunch. And, obviously we'd never been out for a kind of lunch in that way before, as we're taking you seriously. And the editor suggested all these changes and improvements, which were absolutely right. We weren't objecting to any of them. We just didn't bother to do them because we'd got everything we needed from having the business lunch. And I'm very grateful that we never did get the book published. But I find it sort of somehow delightful, that real confidence of youth, that we just thought, well, this will probably happen again. So we don't need to do this. But actually, as I soon learned, it was way, way more difficult than that. And so I started writing all these things. I guess I sort of came back, came out of college in the end at around 25, because I went traveling and all of that. And so there I am in the middle of a recession, trying to sort of create a business in a way of what I do. And then finding, nobody's really interested in what you do. And I was trying to write a children's book. And that sort of says it all, because that is not how you approach it, really. I mean, that's my opinion. You don't really approach, I'm trying to write a book. It's you're either got something to say and you feel it, or you don't. And I think I was trying to sort of people please in a way. So I'm thinking that you can tick this off your list of things that you'd rather like to be able to do. So you can say, I've written a children's book. And I kept having all these thoughts and ideas, and they were just not very good. There might have been something, there might have been enough in them, because every time I submitted one, the publisher would see me, but they always found legitimate fault with them, and would try and help and say, maybe look at this, maybe look at that. And the ideas, as I continued to rework them, just became worse and worse, because then I'm really trying to please and I'm not doing anything I'm interested in. And I remember very clearly, they would sort of show me The Very Hungry Caterpillar or something. This is a very successful book. This is a book that really works. You think, yeah, but it's been written. And that was the sort of moment I realized you can't write a book that's already been written. You can't write a book like somebody else. You can't illustrate like someone else. You have to find your own voice. And I sort of felt like, oh, I'm done with it. I can't do this. And so I started writing a film, or something I thought might be a film, because that's always been my first love, really, cinema. And I didn't know how to do that either, but I didn't have anyone to tell me how not to do it and how to do it. And that was quite good. I had no one to show it to. So I just started writing and drawing at the same time. And it was all dialogue. And I realized I'm quite good at writing dialogue because I watch a lot and I like listening to people talking. And I realized I'm interested in character. I'm not really interested in plot. First and foremost, it's a character that's really important to me. And I think that really released me, because I stopped trying to plot something out and trying to find a story arc. I just followed the characters. And out of that came Clarice Bean, that's me. And I didn't know if it was going to turn into a novel, actually, and be much darker, become an adult book. But then Roddy Doyle's book, Paddy Clark, Ha Ha Ha, I think had come out just around that time. And I thought, oh, I don't want to be seen writing from a child's point of view. And it will look like I'm just sort of jumping on the back of something that's already been done very well. It's not really a logical way to think, but that's how I was thinking. And then the film thing, I wasn't quite sure how to present it to anyone. And then somebody I trusted said, do you know what, Lauren, I think you've written a children's book, or a book that would work for children. So maybe if you adapt it in this way, that will happen. So that was how I actually wrote it.
And within children's publishing, both at that time and today, was it crucial to have an agent? Was that a necessary way in? I mean, how did you go about getting it in front of the right people?
I don't know how long I spent working on the book, but it was probably quite a long time, because I did it sort of here and there. And I worked up some drawings with the graphics over the top. So with the text was integral to the illustration. It's really important the way it was laid out, and it all had purpose and meaning. So every character had a different font, so you could hear their voice as you looked at the pages. So I had a sort of I'd really thought through all of those things. I didn't have an agent at all. I was just sort of working in the dark. And as I say, I really didn't know what I was doing, but that was the best thing about it. So I was liberated from worrying about it, because I stopped going to publishers while I was doing it. And then I did submit it. And the brilliant thing about the years of failure previous to writing this was that I could hear a difference in the way they turned it down, and they were turning it down regretfully. So I think that was very important for me to understand. And if I hadn't had those years of having work turned down and then being told to adjust it in this way or this way, I would have done exactly the same to Clarice Bean, and I would have ruined it, because there were publishers who said, you can't have the illustrations and the writing done in that way. It's too confusing. It's too complicated. Why don't you get rid of the pictures or get rid of the writing? One or the other. You could make this into a poetry book, or just do it as an illustrated book with much simpler text. And because I knew I'd done something good, I ignored them. I do remember a publisher saying, you do know this will never be published. And I felt really fine about that. I said, well, so be it, because I feel I've done something that I'm pleased with. So I'd rather it wasn't published than I make these adjustments. So then I went to America with it. I showed it to a publishing house there. They said, it's far too English. I showed it to publishers here, and they said it's far too American. And, it was kind of bewildering, the whole thing. Then I found a publisher who was really, really interested in it and wanted to take it, but she couldn't get a co-publisher. So they needed American rights on board in order to afford to do it. And that was very much the case. I don't know if it's still the case now, but when someone like me was starting out, they nearly always seem to want to have extra money coming in from another publisher. So it just sort of, it didn't do anything at the publishing houses, but from that I was able to get an agent, because I think they were interested in the fact that publishers had been interested in it. But even so, it still remained unpublished for maybe, I don't know, 4 years, 5 years.
Could we return to your love of film? You've cited Woody Allen and Tim Burton as influences. How did their work shape your understanding of storytelling?
I think watching Edward Scissorhands was incredibly, it was like a moment for me. And it was before I'd written Clarice Bean. But what I saw in that film was very exciting because I saw a vision, a whole thing. So although, yes, there's a screenwriter, and then obviously you've got your casting director and you've got your costume designer and your set designer and your director, and they're all different people, it's still very much a film that couldn't be made without him. It's his vision, just as the same way that Wes Anderson or the Coen brothers make their films, who I also love as well, because they have this cohesiveness. You just feel like you're entering a world that could have only been made by them. And that made me think about, if I'm writing and illustrating, or in my case, I was creating something with the idea of it becoming a film, I wanted to give it that strength of, that sort of identity, that sort of, it's a whole world. It's not necessarily a real world because there is no such thing, how people see the world is different. You can't make a film that's a whole truth. So it's just this sort of moment, and it's your way of showing a truth about something. And so I guess that's when I created Clarice Bean. Yes, it was about that. And I suppose the Woody Allen thing was about the dialogue. I liked the sort of that sense of the talking, the dialogue, the funniness, and again mixed with tragedy. Butch Cassidy is the same. It has that same thing for me. I learned, I think, because I was really crazy about that film when I first saw it as a child, and it's how you can say so much without words, because there's those huge kind of sweeping scenes that you're taken on as they're tracked through the desert. There's barely any talking. There's no music, because the music comes in after the moment where they go off to South America. And so before that, there's a lot of silence, and there's a lot of pictures. That teaches me a lot about picture books, interestingly. It's very similar. It's what can you say without the words, without any sound. And then there's the amazing dialogue between those two characters, which is very, it's very harsh. The way they speak to each other is very harsh. But it's a love affair. They're talking, you can read between the lines. That these people are really close. They're the most important person in, each of their lives. So I think it taught me all of that, just as watching Alfred Hitchcock movies taught me. They're very like picture books in that way, that the sophistication of how he can show you a world on screen. So in Rear Window, which is a very static film, it need not be a film. It's a very strange thing to make into a film, but he makes it full of suspense, and he tells you so much about those characters. So you've got Grace Kelly, who's very high class and a society girl, and he tells you all about the mismatch between her and her fiance, Jimmy Stewart, and who's I think he's a war photographer, and by the way that they're dressed. And just by that, you know that there's something really difficult in this relationship, and he's slightly wriggling from it. And anyway, so I watch a lot of things like that, and they're very, very helpful to me as an illustrator.
Hello, it's Artemis, the producer of Always Take Notes. I hope you're enjoying Simon and Rachel's conversation with the children's writer and illustrator, Lauren Child. So it's time for the next instalment of our segment where we share bonus material from previous guests of the show. This week, it's the historian, Peter Frankopan, and he's going to tell you about a piece of advice he wished he'd had at the start of his career.
I think when you're a writer or a thinker or an academic, there's never really an off button. You never get to go home and switch off. There's never a weekend when you can forget what you're working on. And that feeling guilty is completely normal. I wish somebody had told me that early on. I suppose as an aside, as an academic, I'd also say that I wish I'd been given advice in the first place. No one ever took me to one side and told me what lay ahead, the good and the bad. And I wish I'd been told that that was normal as well. So now I'm a little bit higher up the food chain. I go and look for early career scholars, and I try to listen to them, give them a bit of encouragement, a bit of advice on what might be coming up for them. And I don't just think that's important, that's a really enjoyable part of what I do.
That was Peter Frankopan, and if you were interested in what Peter had to say, you can listen to our full episode with him via our website, which is www.alwaystakenotes.com. Now back to Simon and Rachel's conversation with Lauren Child.
A big, or at least a much discussed point in children's books in the past couple of decades has been the arrival of celebrities, for want of a better word. So people with big existing profiles ranging from David Walliams, Meghan Markle, people like that coming into this space. What are your views on that? And, as someone whose profile comes from having written this sort of stuff, is that a threat, or is there room for all?
I think it really depends on how the publishers work with that, because I am a believer that anyone is allowed to move across and be part of any other art form or even any job, and I would hate to live in a sort of culture that said we're not allowed to move. I'm not allowed to become a singer if I want to. Who says? So I'm not. I think whatever. That's okay. I think the problem has come with the money that then goes with it and is then perhaps taken away from people who do this for their living. So that there becomes a big marketing spend on big names, and there are publishers who very definitely give most of their budget to those who they consider heavy hitters and who can, they'll shift a lot of books, and that's really difficult to deal with. And I do worry for publishing, because if we're to hear in this way that they keep talking about, which is absolutely right, that we should have inclusivity and we should hear from every voice. We should be hearing from a huge range of different people, both artists and writers. Well, there has to be a living wage attached to that. And it is very hard to earn a living as an illustrator these days. I believe from looking at the statistics that these organisations put out, it's something like £10,000 is the average, and it's for a year you'll earn, and that's really difficult. And I have lots of illustrator friends who are giving up, or have to take on a lot of other work, and they're very established illustrators. I'm not talking, goodness knows how it feels to be someone just emerging, just breaking into this, but I'm talking about pretty established people as well. And I worry if we put too much emphasis on making sure that we sell a huge quantity of books by one single person? Are we taking our eye off the ball and losing the creativity of perhaps some really fantastic illustrators, some really fantastic writers, and we're just missing out on them because we're a bit skewed in our, in the direction of making the money. And I understand that, because I mean, books really have hardly gone up since I started. And I started in 1999, and some of the advances have not, gone up. And I'm not bemoaning my career. I've been very fortunate, but royalties, I can tell you, have gone right down, and I could not live off my royalties, and that does worry me, because then, where are we headed in terms of getting these really exciting, brilliant voices? What's going to happen?
To remain on the theme of money, when did writing become sort of something that you could make a living off? At what stage in your career, or with what particular project, did that become sort of a viable source of income?
Well, I think, again, you see, it wasn't how I wanted my life to pan out, but in a way I was lucky, because I didn't have any responsibility. I didn't own anything, and I didn't have any dependents. So that allowed me to be able to accept tiny advances on what is a lot of work. So I think you get paid something like $4,500 to write an illustrator book. And, if I worked, I could probably manage to do, not that you would get this many all piling up at once at the time, but I could probably do a book. A book really would take me 6 months, but I could work all over the weekend, and I could work late into the night, and that was a huge advantage. I also had a job as a receptionist in my friend's graphic design studio, and that was really lucky, because they were very, very good to me. So although it was a small amount of money to do that work, but it was regular money, so it's like it's a proper salary, you see. And then they were very kind, in that they said, so long as you answer the phones and get the coffee and get the lunches, we don't mind if you're sitting at your desk working on your books, that's fine. And so that really gave me that freedom. And then I kept my my Damien Hirst job for 1 day a week, so I was terrified to let that go, because that was just good to have, And so I think I ended up doing those sort of 3 things, and gradually, my bookwork started to come in, and then I could support myself from that. And I can't remember, I'm afraid, at what point that balance sort of just gradually shifted. So I was living off the books, and then I didn't. They very kindly let me keep a desk at their office, actually, because they had a spare desk, but I didn't. I no longer worked for them in the design studio.
And when did it really take off financially for you? I saw in one interview an extraordinary figure saying that by 2009 you were worth over $20 million. I don't know if that's accurate, but when did this become an empire, as it were?
Well, that figure will have been taken, I think, made up from the TV tie-in stuff, I think, which I don't get that money, actually, or a very tiny portion of those, because they made a lot of books off the back of the television. So it sounds very glamorous, but that isn't.
This is for Charlie and Lola, right?
Yeah, that's right. So I've written sort of 6 original Charlie and Lola books, plus a little series for teeny people. based on the not based on the show, based on these characters that I'd come up with. And then obviously what they do is television is they spin each episode into a book. So there are lots and lots of those books, which don't really belong to me. But yes, I think it was probably, for me, it all started to come right a bit before the television, actually. And it was just the fact that I was no longer frightened. I got to that point where I just felt like, now I'm not worrying in the same way that I had been. I had some really nice things happen with the books. I was, as I say, I was quite lucky because Clarice Bean, That's Me, got noticed straight away and shortlisted for the Greenaway, that was a huge confidence boost to me. But I think I probably was unaware at the time of how important that was, because then it gets noticed. And it was more in the days where there's a bit more there was a bit more coverage of children's books. It's rather depressingly gone right down now. So there's very little space to talk about it in any serious way in the papers and even on the radio. It doesn't really get much coverage. But I think for then it did get a bit, and it meant libraries, when libraries were more abundant, that was really important for income as well. So, and then Charlie and Lola, the first one, I Will Not Ever Never Eat a Tomato, that won the Greenaway the following year. So that probably boosted. So things just seemed to go in that direction, which is really good. And then Charlie and Lola got optioned for TV, and so that was probably around 2003, I think, when then that happened. And then it aired in 2004, I believe. And then things did really pick up, because then you become or your characters become a bit of a household name in certain households, and then worldwide as well, because the show really got picked up. So you find that you become a household name in all kinds of funny places, that you never realized that you would, so and I mean funny places, not in strange places, but I mean it suddenly pops up that they've heard of you in a country that you couldn't imagine that they would. And I've just been sorting out all my books, because everything's been in storage for some time, and I realized, gosh, how many foreign editions they used to make of books, and that seems to have really changed, because it used to be that they would print 20,000 of a picture book hardback, and they just expect to sell them. So that was quite normal. And now you sort of feel lucky if they print 5. So it's a very different world. But yeah, it was probably kind of around 2003, 2004, and things just grew with that show.
If you talk about the process of putting together one of your books, once you've got the idea and you become convinced that it's got legs, do you start with the images and then move on to the story? Do you start with the story and then add the images? Do you plot out what you're going to kind of have your characters do, or do you just dive in? Our listeners like to get into the sort of specifics, so feel free to go into as much detail as you'd like.
Sure. Well, if we're talking about a picture book, I usually write them over a number of years. So if I have a little idea, I'll write it down in a notebook. I have lots of them, and it might just be a line of dialogue, or it might be a few lines, and there may be a drawing with it, or there may not, or I may write down a description of somebody I've seen, and then I'll write as much as I can until I get stuck, and then I put it away, and then I get on with something else, and I keep coming back to it. So my most recent picture book is a book called The Goodie, and it's really about the way we will insist on labeling each other. and how we describe children from very early on in just a few words, and you can sort of live with those words for a long time, and it's quite hard to shake them, so it's meant to be a sort of wry look at that issue. And because I try not to write with a big heavy meaning attached, but because it's whatever you as the reader take from it. But with that book, I really did want, it's something that's always frustrated me. So I remember being at a friend, staying with some friends back in 2003, and they kept describing their daughters the goody, or one of their daughters, and it really, I don't know, it really worried me, this. So I started writing this story, and then inevitably I got sort of stuck, and so I put it away. And you can see over time I keep coming back to it and write a bit more and then cross it out, and then it makes it onto my laptop. That's what normally happens when it's got somewhere, and it comes up on my laptop, and then I start doing version after version, so you end up with maybe 16 versions of it. And that book started in 2003, came out I think in 2020 or 2021, I can't quite remember now. And so that's how long sometimes they take to write. And then if you saw my early work for Clarice Bean, I wrote and drew at the same time. And I don't mean drew finished pieces, but drew characters and ideas and thumbnails and things as I went, because I didn't know what I was doing. Now I don't need to do that because I see it all in my head. So I very rarely draw anything before I finish the story, because I can see it happening in my head. And then I work with pencil and collage. So I started using collage and cutting everybody out. So each thing is drawn separately, because that way I can keep moving things around and I can change the scale and I can add things. Because I quickly learned that I was a terrible planner of drawings, just as I am of writing. And so I need it to be very fluid. And you also get these lovely accidents that happen. So if you look at, I will never ever eat a tomato, or ever never eat a tomato. What you notice is that there's a picture of Lola sitting at a wooden table. I think it's the second picture in the book. And that only happened because when I was the receptionist at this design agency, I was cutting things out and I had to keep putting them down because people would keep phoning. And so I was always answering phone calls, and then I would put these cutouts either on my lap or on the desk, and my desk was made of plywood. And I suddenly saw her against wood, and I thought, oh, that's going to look great. So I ran off in my lunch hour to get some of that fake wood paper, and then I started collaging with that. And then I brought in lots of real things. So you'll see that there's a photograph of peas, because I wanted to show how the peas are all the more terrifying if you hate peas, if you actually see real peas. I didn't want to paint them. I wanted to show you these are real peas, and this is what a pea looks like to someone who's very troubled by peas. So that's really what working in that way allowed me, was this happenstance, changing my mind and figuring things out as I went. And I'm just the same as a writer. So when I'm writing my long books, like my Ruby Redford series, which is for young teens, really, they're very, very plotted in a way. If you read them, the plots are very convoluted and they're thrillers. They're really, I was trying to write sort of Elmore Leonard meets Alfred Hitchcock for kids. So that's the idea, is that, you get all the banter, you get all that sort of lovely dialogue and the hanging out and the domesticity that they both put into their films and books. But you also get this good thriller feeling. I can't write a thriller if I know what's going to happen. And so many publishers have tried to get me to plot because they all think it's going to be easier for me if I do that. All that happens is I get really bored because as soon as I know what's going to happen, I can't be bothered to write it. And I read Stephen King's book on writing, and that was the most helpful thing because it really liberated me, because he says he never plots his stories. And I just think, okay, well, if he doesn't plot them, then I don't need to plot them, because his books always take me by surprise, and they're highly plotted in terms of the way that the story kind of links beautifully together and things thread through. They feel plotted, but he plots as he goes. So that's what I do as well.
We're coming up towards the end of our time, but I wanted to ask you about your stint as Children's Laureate from 2017 to 2019. How did that come about? And then how did you find the experience of holding that position?
You get chosen sort of unbeknownst to you. You're not part of it, the process. I think I can't remember if they only ask you when they've decided that they'd like to invite you to be Children's Laureate, and then you can say no. But certainly you used to have very, very little warning. I don't know if they've changed that now, because in a way it's difficult because you can't do any planning beforehand, or very little planning of what you want to say with the time. But there were many things that I wanted to talk about, but I decided really, I wanted to talk about the value of illustration and illustration as an art form, because I was a trustee for the House of Illustration, which is Quentin Blake's. It's now rebranded Quentin Blake's Centre for Illustration, and the importance of it as an art form is not secondary to the words. And it's a very important thing, illustration, particularly in children's books, but beyond as well. So I wanted to talk about that, and how you don't also drawing. We tend in schools to think of it as, well, there are those people who are good at drawing and those people who aren't, and only the people who are naturally talented might want to take it as a subject because you do it because you're good. And I feel very much you should do it because it gives you something, just like you might take up music, or you might even study maths just because you love it, and it's okay. So that was one thing. But the main thing I really wanted to talk about was the fact that we're all creative, and this idea that people fall into different things. I am creative, I'm not creative. I don't believe in that. And the idea that we should have time, space and time. And as I've just said, I might spend 15 years writing a book that only has 800 words. But I only get to those solutions and things I want to communicate by having the time to think about it. And yet we ask children to maybe write a story in 40 minutes. And I think it's kind of unhelpful, really, that we're always pressuring people to have thoughts very quickly, react to things very quickly. Social media is about very quick reactions to things, and I think that can be very damaging because you haven't fully considered what it is you want to say, but you haven't had time to sort of interact. And so as I'm working, I'm sort of funneling things in, and it might be things that come from the radio, things I've heard, it comes from music, comes from looking out of the window, comes from listening to people chatting in the post office. And all of those things, I wanted to encourage particularly children to take note. And as we are more and more inclined to look down as we walk, are we looking down at devices and things, if we're lucky enough to have them, that we sort of forget that there are so many things going on, and our reading of the world around us is very important. So that's a lot what I was talking about.
And a final question from me is about the sort of children's publishing landscape in general. over the course of your career so far, how do you think it's changed, if it's changed at all?
I think because the way artists and writers are paid, that there isn't the time. There is not the time to reflect on what's going on. I think, and I know it can be quite tough being an editor or a designer or people who work in-house as well. So they don't necessarily have the time to mentor the kind of new writers and illustrators. But I was lucky because they did give me that time all those years ago, and they really worked with me. And that's how I learned to become a much better writer and illustrator. And I think if they hadn't have been able to afford me that time, it would have been that much harder, and I would have been, who knows where I would have got to. Who knows if I would have continued to pursue it, or I'd have even been noticed, because you need that input and you need to feel like somebody is championing you as well. That's really important. That sense of you're working, it's not just one person's book, you're working as a sort of team of people. And it was very collegiate when I started. So there was this sense that you could talk about your book, not with your big ego, but you could talk about it as, what do we think's going to work best? So yes, of course, your voice is the predominant voice in it, but I work with some really fabulous people and production people as well, I must say. It's not just about the designer and editor. There are a lot of people who will help to make your work sing, and I think that is what I feel is sadly lost at the moment. It doesn't feel like it's such a process where you have, people working together with you. Having said that, which sounds downbeat, I think that's all part of the creative process too, because that's where I began. I began with things being really difficult and really challenging, and things not necessarily going in the direction I wanted them to. You work with and around what you've got, and I think that is the creative process. You don't sort of get this handle on it and know how to do things for always and forever. You always meet these moments where things are difficult, and that's why I listen to so much radio, I think, and so many interviews with people. Most recently, just to make this very topical, the interviews with Kate Bush, who's having this big sort of moment because her work is being seen again. I mean, it's never not been seen as wonderful and creative, and it certainly has always been highly regarded, but I think it's appealing in a new way to people. But it's not that inspires me so much. What inspires me is her resolve to keep going with what she believes in. She talks about not compromising and doing things because she feels that's the right way to do it for her, and that's what she's interested in. And the same, I think, one could say of someone like Patti Smith. And those two women have been strangely important to me, although they're not from my world at all. But I think it's the way they talk about their work and the need to do their work beyond the need to be selling, the need to be popular, and the need to be sort of liked. And I take great heart from that.
Great. Well, look, Lauren, thank you for being a fantastic guest on Always Take Notes and taking us through so much of your career, and wishing you all the best with your projects going forward.
Thank you.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with Lauren Child. Her website is milkmonitor.me, and she's on Instagram at Lauren Child, that's me. Her latest book, Clarice Bean Scram, is published by HarperCollins Children's.
We wanted to draw your attention to our crowdfunding page on Patreon. If you've been enjoying Always Take Notes, please do consider supporting us there. It helps us to keep the podcast going.
If you support us on Patreon, you can get a great selection of rewards, including a shout out on the show and a selection of successful magazine pitches.
If you pledge $10 a month, you also get a free 2-month trial to Otter, worth $26, alongside the other rewards. Otter offers automated transcription and live note-taking for in-person and virtual meetings. I found it to be a huge help when organising interview material.
Thanks again for supporting Always Take Notes. Hello, it's us again. Rachel, what was your takeaway from the interview with Lauren?
Given her work as an artist and a writer, I thought it was excellent that Lauren offered such a comprehensive insight into how those two disciplines work together. I was also struck by her sense of confidence in her early work, particularly her description of knowing that she had a particular vision for her story, and if it didn't work out or if it wasn't commercially viable, she had at least trusted her instincts, and I guess it paid off. How about you?
I really enjoyed it. And I also thought it was a first for the podcast, because I don't think in the entire history of Always Take Notes, to our shame, really, we've never had a children's writer on. And I suppose we've now started right at the top of that category. So we've established a high bar for ourselves. But it was very different to a lot of the other interviews we've had. And I thought, as you say, I don't think we've had someone who's also been a visual artist on. So really interesting to talk about that. And again, she didn't dodge anything that we asked her, particularly on the impact of celebrities on children's publishing, which is definitely somewhere where feelings run strong. I both read and enjoyed the Clarice Bean book she sent, and I sent it on to my goddaughter, and I was then informed my goddaughter is 4, and apparently she was heard after her bedtime reading it aloud to herself upstairs. So
how sweet.
Yeah, so she's
another fan.
She's got another fan, yeah. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acombe.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin. Our score is by Jess Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, we're on Twitter at Take Notes Always, on Instagram at Always Take Notes. If you'd like to support us via our crowdfunding page on Patreon, we're on there under Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.